Hey, thank you so much
Wow.
for coming in today.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, real quick. So will I just be seeing you, or will I be able to see other people, or?
It's just me.
Okay. All right. Well, that's wild to not be able to see anybody, any of you out there who are there.
But there are 150 people watching right now. That makes you feel
Crazy.
better.
Crazy. What a wild world we're living in. Well, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for spending a little bit of time with me, and thank Michelle and Rob for inviting me to do this. This was when I first got invited to do this many months ago. I was, was honored and excited, and I've been thinking about what to talk about with all of you, and I'm really curious to hear what comes up for folks during this, or what people's ideas or questions or critiques are, because yeah, I took the invitation as an opportunity, which is exactly what my talk is about. Is about bread baking as an opportunity, because you can view anything as an opportunity. You can view anything in lots of different ways, but I think the opportunity perspective allows us to it allows us to help shape our experiences in hopefully productive ways. And sorry, one sec. Dude. I warned my staff that I was going to be giving a talk, but not all of them got the memo. Did you see the panic in my face? Anyway, I'm gonna focus myself now. I'm gonna center myself. So yeah, because bread baking does present us with countless opportunities, and opportunities for reflection, for observation, for nourishment, for, I think one of the biggest ones is, and this is sort of broad, but for learning, and specifically for learning from our mistakes. And perhaps even the word mistake is like a little bit of a misnomer, because anybody who's quick show of hands, I'm just kidding, I can't see you, but if you've baked any bread at all, you are familiar that making mistakes, or ending up with a finished product that is maybe not exactly what you had in your mind, it's part of the process. It happens basically every single time. And the reason that it happens, that I can say that, having baked for 10 years, is that the vision that you have continues to evolve as you continue to learn. And so, there isn't a bake that I have here in my bakery where there aren't many loaves that I pull from the oven that I think, I mean, this is a perfectly good loaf of bread, but look at the way this one is like a little bit asymmetrical, or look at, I baked this one a little bit too dark. This one's baked really perfectly except for that corner. Oh, the slash on this one, I clearly went a little bit too deep, or the angle of my blade wasn't just right, or funny, that one had a lot of oven spring, and this one barely had any oven spring. Um, and I'm not at this point, I've got a team of 10 people, and so I'm not ushering every single loaf from very beginning to very end. Every loaf that we make here is very much a team effort, and ultimately I consider myself responsible for every loaf of bread that comes out of our oven here. And I think anytime that the bread, well, often the bread often something that I have to learn, that I can learn from the bread, is where I can do a better job being a leader, mentor, coach, teacher, um, and the more loaves that we make here, the more, I think in the early days, and I know that lots of bakers feel this way, even if you're not um, trying to make a go of it professionally, but we see, we take it very personally. And so when that loaf, and I think bread has a way of doing this, of grabbing, of like reaching into us and grabbing onto something deep. And so we fall in love with it, and we read into the loaves a lot of meaning. And I think um, I was no exception to that, in the early days of baking alone, but also in the early days of this business, that each loaf I sort of took as like a representation of my own worth, or like, and so when it was flawed, which they all are, it like, uh, it was very hard for me. It was very challenging to see, my flaws manifested in these objects. And I think what's happened over the years is I think I've like gained compassion for the bread, and for myself, and for the members of my team, and for the farmers that grow the grain, and for the millers and distributors who deliver our grain, and for our customers who eat the bread, and for the chefs who we work with, who serve our bread in their restaurant. Right? It's like, the more we have, the more we see bread as an opportunity to increase our own compassion, I think the more compassionate people we can be, which is a good thing. And I think our bread becomes better, and we're able to enjoy it more. And we become better bakers, right? So it's just a net positive all around. God, I wish I could see some of you. like, are you sleeping or are you riveted? I have no idea. It's very provocative. Anyway, God, I went way off course there. Let's see if I can rein myself back in. Yeah, so I think I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities, and talk about some of the pitfalls of these opportunities. And so what do I got? I got like 10 more minutes. Is that right? Give or take? Okay. I'm just going to keep blabbing. You're along for the ride, or you're not. That's cool. Do what you got to do. So opportunity for nourishment. I mean, something that I think we've seen a lot, and especially, I don't think it's true, actually. I was going to say, especially right now in this time where we're physically not spending a lot of time together, but I think if anything, like our relationships have probably, to make a generalization, happy to have you disagree with me. I think probably the number of our relationships have decreased, and the depth of them have increased. That's at least been my experience. But just the simple fact of the, if you're social distancing, which you all should be, which I think most of us are, the number of people that you spend time with is drastically less than you used to. And I think as America fell in love with bread baking a few months back, really warmed my heart to see. I heard from so many people who were just falling in love with bread for the first time, and it was, I considered it a privilege to be able to aid some people in their journey, in the beginning of their journey. And I think the main thing that I really tried to remind people of one of the things I try to remind people of is that bread is meant for eating, right? So it is an opportunity for nourishment, and something that, you know, uh, can be a tendency, and I think is made more so by the role media, social media plays in our lives these days, is the fascination, obsession with the aesthetics of the bread. I'll never forget, I was visiting with my mentor, Dave Miller, out in Chico, California, and I I took one of his loaves of bread and I cut into it cross section, and I was taking a picture of it. And he's like, comes over and he says, "What are you doing, Josie?" And I was like, "Well, take, I'm taking a crumb shot photo for Instagram." And he's like, he's like, "What?" I was like, "Oh, it's all right. You're not on Instagram. You know, it's it's a whole thing. You know, people take pictures of the insides of their breads and it's crumb shot and it's like a whole world." And he was like, "Why would you care about that?" And I was like, that's a good question actually. Why would we care about that? And you know, in that moment, he sort of like broke the spell of of crumb shot culture over me. And he was like, "What? I just care how the bread tastes." It's like, oh, yeah, obviously that's what we should be caring about, what the bread tastes. Now, obviously, you know, you can't taste bread over Instagram. You got to share something. You got to share a pretty picture. And you know, it's not like the aesthetics of bread. I'm not arguing against the aesthetics. It is a creative, you know, artistic pursuit that is a physical object, and I have very particular aesthetic goals that I go for. However, they do have to be held, I think, in balance with the fact that this is a food. This is a basic food that has been made by humans for thousands of years. And a few hours or a few days later, that thing is not going to exist. And really, what the whole structure looked like is irrelevant, right? Now, you can judge certain things by what's happening in there, right? You can judge how the hydration was. You can judge how well it was proofed, how well it was shaped, how well it was baked, all those things. All those things are important and relevant. And the deeper you get into it, the more specific your goals get around those things. And I think we always need to be connecting them back to the eating, to the nourishing quality of the bread, right? Which is, by the way, so for instance, um, you know, one I think potential pitfall, which is a personal opinion, again, happy to be disagreed with. Um, Most of the bread that I prefer to eat, um, I prefer to be mostly whole grain. That's my own personal preference. I like the way it tastes. I like the way it feels. Um, I like the way it makes my body feel. Um, I like the way it looks. I like everything about it more. I think that it was, I think, like a process for me to, you know, to talk about the crumb shot in the social media world. It was like a process for me to realize that the type of bread that I wanted to make wasn't exactly the most popular um, crumb shot because it was mostly whole grain or 100% whole grain. I think the most popular, you know, crumb shot is a white bread, you know, a very white bread with huge holes. And I remember feeling like really like which is, this is stupid, but I felt like a rebel when I was posting my whole grain crumb shots. So I was like, yeah, I'm not posting that. I'm not fitting into the mold. You've got a wild one on your hands here. It's weird not being able to see people. I just really like encourages just like, you know, I mean, I'm just gonna keep going. But I think another thing that we have to consider when making bread is who's eating the bread, right? You know, I consider myself very fortunate to be in the time and place that I am, that the type of bread that I'm interested in making, you know, I'm able to make a successful business out of it. You know, I've thought many times about how if I was in a different place, because I've heard this from bakers around the country, you know, and they're like, I'm like, oh, why aren't you making more whole grain bread? And they're like, nobody would eat it. We tried, and it was good. Nobody wanted it. It's like, yeah, I mean, that's a very, if you're running a business, it's one thing if you're just baking from home, baking for your friends and neighbors and self, and, you know, a lot more leeway there. But if you're trying to make a business out of it, that is a very real consideration that you cannot, you know, you can have your own values and morals around it, but you got to pay the bills. And if you make the best bread in the world that fits precisely with all of your values and nobody buys it, you're not going to be in business for very long. So similarly, I think there is also the opportunity, you know, on behalf of the baker to open people's eyes, minds, palates to things that they might think they don't like, but really it's because they've had bad experiences with a version of this thing. Which is why in the early days we actually didn't really advertise that our bread was whole grain or whole wheat, because most, at least in the States at this point in time, and this is much less the case now than it was 10 years ago, but most whole wheat bread sucks. Sucked. Can I say sucks? Say that? Okay, cool. I mean, frankly, most bread sucks because it's, calling it bread is even a stretch, right? It's just mass produced. It's made to sit on a shelf for as long as possible. It's not really fermented. It's not made with flour that has any character or nutrition. It's not made with enough water. And if it's whole wheat, it's like, you know, which is an unregulated term, it's, you know, made by some Frankenstein process that maybe includes half whole wheat, whole grain, that most likely was rancid, just to like really just tear down the industrial bread complex. I hope that like the head of Pepperidge Farms isn't on this call. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. We're at 20 minutes, but I just got a few more minutes. Yeah. So I think it's also opportunity for observation, which is one of the things that I absolutely love about bread still to this day. Before I was a bread baker, I was a science educator. So I developed elementary and middle school science curriculum. And I'm just such a fan of the scientific process. And one of the reasons that I fell in love with bread is because it has this opportunity to practice science in it every single time. And I just mean that in the basic sense of, all right, I'm going to control the variables. I'm going to go through a series of steps, and I'm going to watch very closely for what happens, and I'm going to be able to connect cause and effect. And when you're first learning how to bake, it's kind of overwhelming. Everything's new. I mean, I baked for months. I baked for months professionally, like selling my bread without ever taking the temperature of anything. And now for you so some of you home bakers are saying, I don't take the temperature either. That's fine. Don't worry about it. At some point, you'll start taking the temperature of things, of the room, of the flour, of the dough, And you will be able to start connecting the cause and effect of, oh, when things are warmer, fermentation happens faster at every step in the process. And fermentation can change at different temperature ranges. And so it is such an amazing opportunity for that cause and effect connection, observation, evidence gathering, hypothesis making process. That is, I mean, I think one of the things that I love about it is that part of the process is, it's as close to objective as you're going to get, right? All right, it's 82 degrees in here, right? The dough has been fermenting for 42 minutes, right? These numbers are just numbers, period. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff, whole mysterious, spiritual, creative, artistic side to the process, which I also love about bread making, and which is, it's a bit more slippery. It's like a little harder to pin down exactly what's going on. And it's also subjective, right? Because people taste things differently. They have different ideals. They prioritize different things. And that is part of the beauty of being a baker, is you get to have this science and this craft, this art, come together into a process and a delicious product. Let's see here. One of the things that made me fall in love with bread at the very beginning was the fact that it presented me with the opportunity for patience. It was actually one of the things. So before I started bread baking, I was kind of confused about what I was going to do next professionally, and I actually made a list of characteristics of what I thought my next, or of what I thought I would find fulfilling in my next thing. And I didn't know what my next thing was going to be. But one of the things was, God, it would be great if it was an opportunity to practice patience, because I'm not very patient. And I have a hunch I would be a better person if I were more patient. I have a hunch that I would be able to appreciate the presence more if I were more patient. That I would be able to be a better friend if I were more patient. That I would be more compassionate with myself if I was more patient. And bread baking, again, in a very concrete way, it's like, your job right now is to wait. You cannot, there's nothing to do. You have to just wait for the process of fermentation to run its course. And I believe that the best bread that I've had, all of the best loaves that I've had, they're made over the course of a couple of days, right? So the life of that loaf starts 24 to 48 hours before it's a finished loaf of bread. And I just loved that from the very beginning. That, there's a lot of cultural pressure, I think, to go, to capitalize on every moment, to maximize, to economize, right? It's like a very American perspective, and I think intrinsically a harmful, disrespectful, insensitive perspective. That bread, just sort of peacefully comes along, and once you interact with it, once you start a conversation with bread, it's one of the things that it lets you know right away. Hey, just so you know, if you want to talk with me, if you want to dance with me, like, you're gonna have to learn how to, like, slow down. And it's great. I think it's one of the more powerful things that bread has taught me, the importance of slowing down and fostering that patience in myself. I think last of all, and then I'll see if there are any questions, if there's anybody even out there, is the opportunity for generosity, right? Because I do think that that is fundamental to bread. Most breads, I think this is true. It's kind of poetic, so we'll go with it. Is most breads are a quantity of food that's more than for just one person in one meal. We're talking about a loaf of bread. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that bread is part of why it has played such a critical role in humanity since we discovered it, or since it revealed itself to us, is because of the way that it brings people together. Because in its essence, it is something that is meant for more than one person. And so, again, when I first started baking, these are all kind of lessons that I couldn't have put them to words when I first started baking, but now in hindsight, I'm like, oh, that's what it was doing. That's why I loved this, is because when I first started baking, that very first loaf, right? I go through the process. Wow, God, it's just kind of cool. It's like just making me wait. It's like, oh, this is interesting. It's like a blend of science and craft. Like, I'm measuring these things to very precise amounts and taking really careful observations. And also, like, I can tell that there's this like thing that I cannot really put my finger on involved, and some sort of like mysterious component to it that's very intriguing, and like a venue for expression and creativity. And then the nourishment piece, I think it's directly connected to the generosity piece, right? Because it's not just nourishing for ourselves; it's nourishing for our communities, our friends, our families, strangers. And it just felt amazing to be able to share, to have this contribution, to bring this offering, to bring to other people that I had created through this mysterious alchemical process. And right away it was like, oh, you bring a loaf. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this. You bring a homemade loaf of bread to your friend's house, or you drop it off on your neighbor's doorstep. It's magical, and people respond to it like it's magic. They're like, you make this, and it's still warm. This is warm. It's like you gifted them a winning lotto ticket or something. Brand new iPhone. So yeah, I think that about sums it up. I could keep going, but it's been a half hour. We'll see if anybody has anything to say.
I have tons of questions pouring in, Josey.
Oh.
If you will mind entertaining a few.
No, of course.
So we'll get to the technical ones. There's quite a few about like really specifics when it comes to baking. But one that Natalie had on YouTube, she was asking, going back to when you were talking about the inconsistencies that you saw in like, shape and look and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you run into problems with that when you're baking it as a product, as something that you're trying to sell on, or how do you get around that?
Yeah, so I think, well, that's a subjective thing, right? Because I think that I try to always remember that every single loaf of bread that we make here and that goes out to the public could be somebody's first loaf of bread that they've ever had of ours. And, it better be good if that's the case. And the reality is that, like, when I pick up a loaf of our bread, I see a very different thing than someone who's picking up our loaf for the first time. Because of the years, because of the months, because of the days, right? Like, and so, I mean, I think we do a very good job of keeping our standards very high and keeping our product very consistent. And there are some days and some loaves that, for any number of reasons, right? We just went through a heat spell. Like, managing the fermentation through that heat spell was very challenging. And, so what happened one day, our sandwich loaves fermented much more than usual because we didn't counteract by manipulating the temperatures appropriately. And so, we baked them off, and they were super voluminous, really, really big. However, what happened is that the tops of the loaves baked quicker than the bottom of the loaves because they're in pans, and the loaf was more airy and the top of the loaf was higher. And so by the time the bottom of the loaf got fully baked, the top of the loaf was burnt, right? And, one of my team members said in the moment, like, it's a little dark, but it's, this is perfectly delicious bread. But then we get an email from a customer and says, like, hey, I've been buying your bread for years. This is the loaf that I got. Like, it's burnt. And it's like, God, thank you for communicating with us, because we made a mistake. We judged wrong, because hearing your perspective, like, you are right, sir, that loaf is burnt. We shouldn't have sold that to you. I'm so sorry. And anytime I get one of those emails, I'm so touched that someone took the time to communicate with me, because I know that it would be so much easier to just say, like, this bread sucks. Like, this bread isn't what it used to be. Like, I'm not buying this. Like, I got ripped off, or like, anything like that. Now, I get very few of those emails, because, like I said, my team does a phenomenal job of keeping the quality very high and consistent. But yeah, it's still something that we wrestle with. It's very hard. It's very, very freaking hard to have the bread be consistently very high quality because of the changing variables, not just the heat swings, heat waves, because of the changing flour and the changing temperature in our fridge. For years, we had a fridge that, like, broke pretty regularly, which wreaks havoc on the predictability of your fermentation. Oven malfunctions, and then differences in everybody's own learning and judgments and skill level. All those things make it challenging, but otherwise we'd be bored, so it's fine.
You have to mix it up every once in a while.
Totally.
Well, another question kind of along those lines, going back to being a home baker. A lot of the people who watch our series are home bakers. Yep. And you've thrown in some great tips already about patience and mindfulness in your baking. But do you have any other kind of more technical tips that you could tell some of the home bakers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think minimize variables when you're first learning. So to be less jargony, like, keep stuff the same except for one thing. So, if you're just learning, or you're really trying to, or you're not just learning, and you're really trying to refine and really trying to, like, create the loaf that you have in your mind's eye, you got to get really scientific about it. You got to get really specific about it. So, only change one thing at a time, because if you change more than one thing at a time, you're not going to be able to connect cause and effect, right? You're not going to be able to say, oh, it's because I bulk fermented the dough for 30 more minutes that I was able to achieve a little bit more sourness, right? Because if you change that and you change the way you feed your levain, you're not going to know what exactly did it, right? And you can do that with any of the variables, with the hydration, with the fermentation, with the time, with the shaping technique, with the bake, all that stuff. So as much as possible, I tell people to once you develop a recipe or loaf that's like good, then just start chugging away at it each time. Tweak one thing and try as hard as you can to keep everything else exactly the same. That's impossible because every day is different. But the more you can do that, the more you will be able to connect cause and effect. And ultimately, what you'll be able to do, if you stick with it long enough, is you'll be able to bake the loaf of bread you want anywhere at any time, right? Which sounds like, oh, that's what the heck, but that is so hard to do that. You take somebody who's an extremely skilled baker who makes the most beautiful bread in the world in their home every day, put them a couple hundred miles in any direction with different flour in a different kitchen with a different oven. I mean, that's going to be a real hard test to pass. And but it's fun. I once went to Australia. I got invited to Australia to go to a food conference, and the first loaf of bread that I baked, and luckily it was the day before the conference, it was the crappiest loaf of bread I had
No.
in so long. I was so embarrassed. And what I did was because I'd been doing exactly what I'm advocating. I took temperature. I kept records of everything I'd done with that loaf, and I went back through and I was like, okay, what did I do? What did I do? What did I, narrowed it in to my starter was not quite as active as it should have been. I think that's part of it. I think I rushed the bulk ferment a little bit, and I think I added like 5% too much water. And so the next day I went back and I changed all those things, and I made some of the best bread that I'd ever made.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, you have to have that, real innate relationship with the chemistry, right? Rather than just kind of necessarily following recipe, I suppose. One last question. It's related to a question that I also have for you. What was that aha loaf for you? When was the first time you had a bread that was like the game changer?
That I made or that I'd eaten?
Either.
Jeez. Well, as far as that I'd eaten, I feel like I've got memories. Well, a few come to mind that are from a long time ago. One was eating this black pepper Parmesan bread
Ooh.
in Vermont with my mother when I was a child. We would make it into toast, and yeah, it was good. We make black pepper Parmesan here as well because of that experience, and also this apricot sage bread from this bakery in Massachusetts called the Hungry Ghost. Um, those I don't know, those loaves came up for me right now. But then as far as like the bread that I make, I think it was really probably that very first loaf of bread that I made, because it was sourdough loaf. It was the first time that I'd made bread, and I was just absolutely floored by the fact that it was pretty good, and it was the first time I'd ever done it.
Hmm.
And it had all these opportunities or characteristics to the experience that I couldn't have given language to at that point, but really like were fulfilling, spoke to me in a very deep way. And yeah, I think that what I really take it upon myself as like my goal anytime I'm doing anything like this or teaching or speaking, is to try to help people have an experience like that, because I was lucky to I think to a certain extent that my first experience was like that, because it allowed me to do it again, right? Whereas if I'd had a negative experience where like the loaf was really didn't taste good, I think I would have been pretty discouraged by that. And I think that bread has so much to offer us, but we have to kind of like fall for it first. And I had like a great first date. I guess I'm like a relationship coach between people and bread. And what I'm trying to do is
Aww.
like make the first date go really well, so that they can eventually commit to one another
Oh,
forever.
what a perfect way to wrap up that talk. It's brilliant. It's lovely because we, in this series, as many of you know, those of you that have been watching quite a few of them, I mean, we've hit this from the scientific angle, we've hit it from the chemistry, real nuts and bolts history, when were the first sourdoughs ever produced, we think, and now to the spiritual and the relationship. So it's lovely. You can take whatever you want out of bread baking, and it's there for you. So thank you so much, Josey. I really appreciate the time. I could keep you here for like 3 more hours with the questions that we've had. But I'm sure people can get a hold of you online somewhere if they really, really.
Yeah. They can email me or go to my website. It's just joseybakerbread.com, or they can email me howdy@joseybakerbread.com. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, before I let all of you go, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't do a plug for the next few weeks that are coming up. Josey's kicking off like this all-star cast that's happening on September 10th. We have Chef Francisco Migoya is going to be here to talk about starters. Do you put raisins in it? What do you do with leftovers, etc.? So bring your questions for him. And then the week after that, on September 17th, we're going to be talking about pickling with the Vivian Howard is going to be joining us. And this is going to be a joint production between us and Quail Ridge Books, and also the Museum of Life and Sciences in Durham. So yeah, stick around. We're back after a needed break, and we're going to be here all fall with talks. And thanks again, Josey. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you everyone for coming.